My brothers and sisters, our good news is recorded for us according to John. As Jesus passed by, he saw a man blind from birth. His disciples asked him, "Rabbi, who sinned, the man or his parents, that he was born blind?" Jesus answered, "Neither, nor he or his parents sinned. It is so that the works of God might be made visible through him. We have to do the works of the one who sent me while it is day. Night is coming, and when no one can work. While I am in the world, I am the light of the world." When he had said this, he spat on the ground and made clay with his saliva. He smeared the clay on his eyes and said to him, "Go wash in the pool of Siloam," which means sent. So he went and washed and came back able fully to see. His neighbors and those who had seen him earlier as a beggar said, "Isn't this the one who used to sit and beg?" Some said, "It is." Others said, "No, he just looks like him." He said, "I am he." So they replied to him, "How were your eyes opened?" He replied, "The man called Jesus made clay and anointed my eyes and told me, 'Go to Siloam and wash.' So I went there and washed, and I was able to see." And they said to him, "Where is he?" The man said, "I do not know." They brought the one who was once blind to the Pharisees. Now Jesus had made clay and opened his eyes on the Sabbath. So then the Pharisees also asked him how he was able to see. He said to them, "He put clay on my eyes, and I washed, and now I can see." So some of the Pharisees said, "This man is not from God because he does not keep the Sabbath." Others said, "How can a sinful man do such amazing signs?" There was division among them. So they said to the blind man again, "What do you have to say about him since he opened your eyes?" And he said, "He is a prophet." Now the Jews did not believe that he had been blind and gained his sight until they summoned the parents of the one who had gained his sight. They asked them, "Is this your son who you say was born blind? How does he now see?" His parents answered and said, "We do not know. We know that this is our son and that he was born blind, but we do not know how he now sees, nor do we know who opened his eyes. Ask him. He's of age. He can speak for himself." His parents said this because they were afraid of the Jews, for the Jews had already agreed that if anyone acknowledged him as the Christ, they would be expelled from the synagogue. For this reason, his parents said, "He's of age. Ask him." So a second time, they called the man who had been blind and said to him, "Give God the praise. We know that this man is a sinner." He replied, "If he is a sinner, I don't know. One thing I know is that I was blind, and now I see." So they said to him, "What did he do to you? How did he open your eyes?" He answered them, "I told you already, and yet you do not listen. Why do you want to hear it again? Do you want to be his disciples as well?" They ridiculed him and said, "You are that man's disciple. We are disciples of Moses. We know that God spoke to Moses, but we do not know where this one is from." The man answered and said to them, "This is what is so amazing, that you do not know where he is from, and yet he opened my eyes. We know that God does not listen to sinners, but if one is devout and does his will, he listens to him. It is unheard of that anyone ever opened the eyes of a person born blind. If this man were not from God, he would not be able to do anything." They answered and said to him, "You were born totally in sin, and yet you are trying to teach us." Then they threw him out. When Jesus heard that he had been thrown out, he found him and said, "Do you believe in the Son of Man?" He answered and said, "Who is he, sir, that I might believe in him?" Jesus said to him, "You have seen him, and the one speaking with you now is he." The man said, "I do believe, Lord," and he worshiped him. Then Jesus said, "I came into this world for judgment, so that those who do not see might see, and those who see might become blind." Some of the Pharisees who were with him heard this and said to him, "Surely we are not the blind ones, are we?" And Jesus said to them, "If you were blind, you would have no sin. But now you are saying, 'We see,' and so your sin remains." The gospel of Christ. Praise be to you, Christ. Please be seated. Thank you, Marcus. I didn't know how long you were going to be able to play all that.
Years. I could play for years.
I remember as a kid, one of my favorite games to play in a swimming pool was Marco Polo. I always thought, when my father and I played, I always believed that I had him, duped. That he didn't see that I was really trying to, I had my eyes squinted and I could sort of see through the little, creases. But the whole purpose of Marco Polo is that you cry out Marco, and then the person who is also in the pool is supposed to say polo, so that you can identify what direction they're in and move in that direction and tag him. My father always allowed me to tag him. I bring up that story because, there is something about in this story that surprises and shocks me, is that the man born blind isn't crying out. He's not saying anything. Jesus doesn't go to him because the man's crying out and Jesus hears him and responds. He's simply a man born blind, and as one born blind can't work, and so he sits on the street. He's not even outside the temple, which would be a typical place for the best in donations. The absolute best donations came if you sat outside the entranceway into the temple, or for people going in and coming out. This man is just sitting on the street, and everyone, the neighbors, all know that he is blind and that he was born blind. They saw him as a child growing up and that he was born blind. And yet this man's not crying out in any way, shape, or form. He's not yelling. He finds out that it is Jesus, because they say, who is the one, when he's being interrogated, who is the one? He says, the man Jesus. But it doesn't even say, the gospel doesn't tell us how he knows that it's Jesus, because he doesn't meet him physically face to face until the end of the story. So somewhere in the midst of all this, there's this encounter that takes place. And if you remember last week, the most profound part of that entire story of the woman at the well is that Jesus goes out of his way to find that woman in the middle of the day by the well and encounters her there. And here we have the same thing again. Jesus actually sees and goes and approaches the man. The man never asks for healing. He never asks. And look, you got to put it in perspective, right? There are plenty of gospel stories where people are crying out, Jesus, Son of David, have pity on me, a sinner, right? There's others who are saying, you have this power, you have this authority, you can make me whole. You have this woman who's going by just so she could touch the tassel of his cloak. You have all these people making and saying and doing all these things to encounter Jesus because they know who Jesus is and they believe and they have faith and they trust, and Jesus ultimately makes them all whole. This man doesn't do anything. He's just sitting there. He's just sitting there. He doesn't ask to be healed. Doesn't ask for anything. Doesn't try to get Jesus' attention, and yet Jesus goes out of his way, sees him, and chooses him to encounter and to bring about this healing of a man born blind to regain his sight. And we hear it later when the man now who can see is giving testimony and saying, nobody There is nowhere in the scriptures, nowhere up until this point, in none of the Hebrew scriptures, you will find a man or a woman born blind who is restored completely of sight. And he's basically saying, if this has never been done before, how is it possible that you're considering this man, Jesus, a sinner not sent from God, if he's the one who has established and has done this miraculous thing that our Jewish history for thousands of years doesn't carry a story? How is that possible, right? The thing that's interesting here is, he goes, he washes, he comes back, and the neighbors stumble across him, and they're like, who are you, And he can't look any different except for the fact that now he sees, right? He's got to be wearing the same clothes. Doesn't say he stopped anywhere and bought anything. I mean, he basically is there, but they can't believe that a man born blind is possible to have sight. Now, let's go back and understand exactly what the issue is here for Jewish law. The Jews believed that if you had any type of infirmity, if you had any type of illness, disease, blindness, muteness, whatever the case might be, whatever it is, even if you have bad experiences or financial crisis or ruin, all of this has been established and done unto you because of sin. And because of this one little line out of the book of Exodus that talks about sin being handed down generation to generation. It doesn't necessarily mean that it's anything that you yourself did. It could be something your great-great-grandfather did, but because of that now is handed down generations. There is a very firm belief that illness and sickness, blindness, and the like all comes about because you are being punished for either your sin or someone else's. There are actually rabbis at the time who wrote that even babies in the womb could sin. This is how prevalent this thinking is. So now imagine, if you will, a person born blind is either one of the babies who sinned in the womb or actually has been now cast upon by God. Remember, all this is being done by God for recompense for something that was done in your family. This is their mindset. They believe this absolutely. And because of that, there is no way to remove the sin. And so in order for a person to regain their sight, their sin in their theology would have to be removed. And they don't have any way of doing that. Remember that. We'll come back to that later. But in this case, this man is looked upon, and so the neighbors want to know, well, no, you can't do this, right? So this is the thing that gets me, and I'm not sure if we really pick it up, but the neighbors, the people who knew him, the people who saw his plight, the people who passed him, people who probably gave him bread, people who tried to help, someone that he lived side by side all these years, instead of being ecstatic that he has regained his sight, they drag him in front of the Sadducees and Pharisees. They bring him to their religious leaders, and they say, he can now see. Like, they call him out. They don't even, the guy just has his sight how long? And what's the first thing you're going to end up seeing? Your neighbors dragging you off, and then you're standing in front of your religious leaders who are now pestering you. They've asked him 3 times. Possibly a few of them were deaf and maybe needed healing of hearing, but basically in a very real way, they cannot get over, and John is making it clear, they cannot believe that he was born blind and can now see. Who has that power? Who has that authority but God? And yet they're asking, who is it? And the man says, this person, Jesus, which he probably picks up somewhere in a conversation because he's not calling out for Jesus. He doesn't even ask to be healed, and yet Jesus pursues him and chooses him and restores him, but now things get worse for him. He was almost better as a beggar, blind, sitting on the thing because nobody bothered him. They gave him some coin, he got something to eat, he went home at night, got up the next day and did the whole thing all over again. Now all of a sudden he's being dragged in front of people to give testimony, and you can imagine imagine just what this is all like. Imagine the first people you look at are these neighbors. And then on top of that, this leadership. It's got to be absolutely profound for him to be stuck in this situation. So anyway, what's he supposed to do? So he's standing there and he's telling the truth. What does he know? He was blind. He didn't ask to be picked out. He got picked out by Jesus. Next thing you know, he can see. He's telling the truth. I mean, what else can he do? So they're like, okay, you were never born blind. Let's get his parents in. Now, you could imagine how this went, right? So the neighbors go over. They find his parents. They drag his parents in front of the Pharisees and Sadducees, and they're asking him, is this your son? And I'm sure they wanted to say, no, we never saw him before ever. Nothing. No, I don't know. He looks sort of familiar, but, no, yes, this is our son. Yes, he was born blind. But we don't know anything about how he restored his sight, and we know nothing about the man, nothing. And they're doing all this because they're terrified. You can imagine these ordinary people, right? Even the poor blind man now who can see are just ordinary folks being dragged in front of this court of questions. And so they just beg off. But the man, as much as he's being asked, if you see how it's stirring inside of him, he cannot deny the encounter that he has with Jesus. He can't, because he has a physical change in his life. And so because of that, he stands firm. Why? He was blind. Now he can see this man Jesus, so obviously this man Jesus must be something special. The problem is, again, because sin brings about the blindness, and the blindness was installed and established from birth, means that he is suffering from some sin of the past. Who has the authority to take away this sin? And John's point is Jesus. John's point in the gospel is Jesus is the one who takes away sin. Jesus is the one who strips all that and makes that whole. And so when even his disciples ask him early on, when they see the man born blind, and this must be a reputation. Oh yeah, there's the guy. He's that guy who was born blind, right? I mean, that's probably how he was recognized. And even his disciples says, whose sin is it that he's suffering from, right? So this is so innate into their thinking that having Jesus being able to come and restore the person is one thing. But listen, Jesus is in much more trouble even than that, okay? Much more trouble. You would think just healing him would have been enough problems, but, oh, by the way, it's healing on the Sabbath, okay? Now, the law says that if someone is in trouble on the Sabbath, you can help them. And if they're sick, you can help heal them. However, because he is born blind, it doesn't make any difference if you wait a day. So it didn't have to be done on the Sabbath. It could have waited to the next day in their thinking. He's been like this all his life. One more day wouldn't have mattered. Why did you disrespect the Sabbath by doing this? But you would think that is the big problem. It's not the problem. See, one of the 32 things you cannot do on the Sabbath is you cannot knead. You know how you make dough and you got to do that whole kneading action? You use your fingers. Well, Jesus makes mud and mixes the mud. And it breaks one of the major rules of what you can't do on the Sabbath. And so the man's in trouble because he can now see, and Jesus is in trouble because he restored sight, and oh, by the way, he did some sort of a kneading action that is against the laws for the Sabbath. And so they declare that Jesus is a sinner. And the man says, I don't know if he's a sinner or not. I don't know anything about him except for I couldn't see, now I can. Now all of a sudden you want me to tell you that he's a sinner. I don't know that. So the man The man is outside of society, outside of the religious structure anyway, because he's born blind and therefore a sinner. So he is distanced and put off. Now, because he declares that this Jesus is the one who healed him and must be from God because of the authority and power that he shows, he is now excommunicated from the temple. So whether he was blind or now that he can see, the establishment, the institution, the religious institution cannot and will not accept him. And so he is cast out. And this is the part that I find really interesting. He was the man born blind who can now see. Jesus went and sought him out to establish his physical sight. But now he is cast out from his community. At least when he was born blind, he could live in a Jewish neighborhood, and people would feel bad for him, and they would toss him whatever and try to help him along or whatever. But, it's what it was, and there was a little bit of sympathy for him because of the state and status he was in. But now that he is excommunicated from the institution, he's not able to do that. He's not able to live among his own. He's not able to hang out with his mom and dad. He's not able to be with his neighbors because he has been cast out. And what happens? Jesus hears that he's cast out, and Jesus goes once again, but this time not to establish physical sight, but spiritual sight. Jesus is attentive to this nobody for all practical purposes. The man, after he's healed and goes through all of this rigmarole, telling the story how many times, right? After going through all this, he doesn't even go looking for Jesus. I mean, I don't know about you, but if I had a malady or a disease and somebody healed me, I'd probably want to go and at least shake their hand, give them a hug. He doesn't do any of that. It's Jesus who follows and goes after him. The thing about John's gospel and how John understands and experiences Jesus is that nobody is left behind. Nobody. And it doesn't matter whether it's a physical issue or whether it's a spiritual issue, an institutional issue. It doesn't make any difference to Jesus. Jesus, if the man doesn't have enough sense to go and say thank you, to seek him out, which, by the way, after the kind of day I just had, now being excommunicated, I'm not sure this Jesus would be the one I'd want to go and hang out with right away. I might need a day or two to clear my head and figure out what to do with this. However, it doesn't matter to Jesus because Jesus knows now what is he suffering. He's suffering spiritual pain. He doesn't know who he is. He's no longer a Jew. He's cast out. Can't worship. And now he doesn't, all he knows is now he can see, but now there's no connectedness. And Jesus cannot hold himself back when he sees any of us in trouble or difficulty, suffering, pain, or our own blindness. Jesus is always pursuing us, always, even when we don't want to be pursuing him, or when being a Christian somehow gets us in trouble because we believe certain things and we hold fast to what we believe, even though the rest of the world is stumbling and crumbling apart. We're still the people who are called to have hope. We're the people who are called to be generous. We're the people who are called to love in the spite of a world that there is so much that we can hate. But love is what we're challenged to do, and that is difficult and challenging. And sometimes at the end of the day, it is exhausting. What I like to visualize in my own prayer time is the fact that when I'm sitting down and exhausted and worn out, and when I am frustrated and angry and all this stuff is going on and there's only so much you have control of, what I like to really understand and I deeply believe is that Jesus is already there. Jesus was already seeking me out even before I got to that point. He was already looking for me. Why? Because we're all precious in His sight. We're all precious. And by the way, in case you say to yourself, well, you know, I'm not physically blind. We're all blind. There's something about humanity. We all suffer blindness. We do. And to tell you the truth, sometimes we don't even realize we're blind. You know, sometimes even in our best intentions, somehow, somewhere, something or other, we've made decisions, we've made choices, we've chose a way of thinking, we isolate individuals, people, groups, whatever the case might be. We all struggle with blindness, and if it's not physical, it's spiritual, it's moral, it's emotional. We're all struggling with that. And what I like about this story and what I like about the Jesus that John has encountered and portrays to us is that this Jesus is actively seeking us out. Actively. You don't know how long it took for Jesus to find the guy. Listen, when the guy gets thrown out of the temple, right, he's not hanging around the neighborhood. He's basically has to leave the town. He has to leave the area. So who knows how far this man wandered into oblivion trying to figure out what is it that I'm supposed to do next. And yet, Jesus goes and he finds him. But recognize, if you will, the man can see, but he's still got problems. The man can see, but he still has problems. He can't go home. He can't go back to where he was. He'll never be that same person again. And honestly, after the encounter, it's not like Jesus hands him a bunch of money and tells him, you could have a house here, and by the way, here's a bunch of fields growing, and you'll be able to eat and sustain yourself. All he gives to the man is the recognition and the knowledge of knowing that the one who has restored you now twice, physical blindness and spiritual blindness, is the Messiah, the Christ. And that changes the man, that no matter what happens for the rest of his days, he knows that he has encountered the Christ, the Son of the ever-living God. And no matter how hard things get, no one can take that away from him. No one can take away the fact of his encounter and the reality of that encounter. This is why I constantly challenge us to stop running around looking for Jesus in 100 different ways and just settle down. See, doesn't it tell you something? We think somehow that finding God is something that we have to do. We keep thinking that finding God, if we do X, Y, and Z, and if we do it enough times and enough days and enough seasons, right, that we will all be somehow finally in His presence. The problem is that every story we read in the gospel is that Jesus is already on His way. He's already there. All we have to do is settle down, stop, just to stop, and allow His presence to fill us. He's already there. There's nowhere to run. We always think that God is hidden somewhere, that God is off in some distant realm, and we have to get His attention. And yet these gospel stories have a Jesus who is very proactive and is already there. But we're still running around. And I sometimes wonder whether or not it's a little bit like Marco Polo. I wonder if Jesus is crying out, Marco, just hoping that we might be able to respond, Polo. Is it really that simple? It's not my words. It's in Scripture. It's what the disciples knew and experienced of Jesus. And yet somehow we've taken it and we've turned it all upside down, that we have to jump through all these hoops. And I think in some real way, Jesus is like, no, I already knew you were in trouble. I already knew you were in pain. I already knew you were suffering. I already know that you're blind. And it's okay. I've come all this way. I'm here now to be with you. Please stop spinning. Just turn around. I'm right here. I'm right here. So I pray that this week God allows us to understand that there's no big search. This isn't any great Discovery Channel episodic event. It's as simple as recognizing that in every instant, every concern, every issue, every pain, disease, illness, issue of our life, every single thing, Jesus is already there. He's already there. God bless you.